last week, we talked about proportions, and we talked about the different sighting techniques, right? So using thumb measurements and comparing the different sizes and the different parts of the objects that you're looking at in order to basically create or assess ratios, right? So something is twice as big as something else. Something is 1.5 times as big as something else, right? Whatever the size comparison is. And then making that same size comparison on your drawing, okay? When we look at what that looks like in closer to a finished project, so kind of a step beyond what we're doing. Are you all with us? I don't see everybody's attention up here. Okay, here's kind of an example of what the next step for us is going to look like. Okay, so this was a demo that I did. This was from years ago. This is one class period worth of work, so this is by no means finished or complete. This is just started, okay? But the techniques that I used to draw this are exactly the same techniques that you guys learned last week and that you practiced last week, and that we are now going to take a step further with color, okay? So in the case of this apple, first of all, look at how large the drawing is compared to the actual fruit, right? Why can we be able to make this large and still have it be accurate even though the fruit is small? Anybody get what I'm getting at? I might not have asked that in the greatest way. What'd you say?
The proportion thing that you're doing?
It has to do with the proportion thing that we were doing, yes. We know specifically a little more how we can get this to be larger. When we're doing the thumb thing, right, we take that first measurement. We cannot just keep that measurement and put it right down to our page. Remember? Okay? Because when you're measuring like this, your measurements are maybe this big, right, at the end of your arm. If you take that and put it down on your page, well, then you have a drawing that's this big. And that's fine if you want a drawing that's this big, but when you are looking at these objects, the whole point of this is an art class, right? This is not a scientific illustration class. So we're drawing them in a way, ideally, that is artful and interesting to our viewers, right? Well, something like this, there's color in there, that's cool. There's interest in there, there's visual engagement in there, right? And if you're only drawing everything this big, you're not going to be able to capture that. That's very limiting, right? So I, as the artist, and you, as the artist, will be able to make the same choice. I made the choice to make it larger because I wanted space to show all the cool colors and cool dimension that's happening in there. Does that make sense? Emily, everything okay? What you doing? Okay, close it, please. So, things that I compared, okay, in this proportion. What I started out with was the height of the apple compared to the width of the apple, okay? Now in this case of this particular apple, they're pretty close, if not almost identical height versus width, right? But when you have a proportion like that, where it's like, oh, okay, the height and the width are the same, cool, like that's really easy, and it is, but just like with grids, remember how I said your brain is gonna kind of wanna take over and make assumptions, right? You're still gonna kind of fight a little bit of a similar battle there. Your brain is gonna say, okay, well the height and the width are the same, so it must be round. Well, is it round? Not exactly. There are some rounded parts to it, right? But what strategies can we use to actually measure and to actually accurately represent what those curves are actually doing? We can do our hands on a clock at all the different points around the apple, right? One of the strategies that I learned in drawing classes was how to draw a circle, right? And if you try to just put your pencil down and draw one continuous line, you're going to get a circle, but it's not going to be as nice or as perfect as we try to aim for, right? So a strategy that I learned was to kind of draw little sections of straight lines. And eventually, if you keep drawing little sections of straight lines, eventually that shape goes from, maybe an octagon or a pentagon down to a lotagon, right? And then the angles get smaller and smaller and rounder, and you eventually get your circle. It's not going to happen in one smooth line. It happens by a series of gradual adjustments. And this is very much that same technique. It's just that instead of aiming for that perfect circle, we are aiming for whatever the accurate angles are of that particular shape. Does that make sense? Okay, it's one of those things that if you are not careful, and if you don't get yourself in the habit of checking and rechecking, okay, your brain is going to start making assumptions. Okay, so watch out for that. Know that that is going to happen. Other things that I did once I had the outer shape is I started looking at this kind of dimple, whatever you want to call that, like the belly button of the apple, right, where the stem is. How far down from the top does that reach? How many of those spaces fit within the height of the apple or within the width of the apple? Where does this fall? It doesn't necessarily just have to be centered, right? Some of this, like this angle over here is a little steeper. This one's a little bit more of a corner. So where within that width does that little dimple fall? Measure that out, right? And then the benefit of having two objects is now we're having some interaction within those objects. Just like you guys had a grid before, and you were looking at where does this object overlap the grid line, right? Now we can look at where does this object overlap the other object, right? It's exactly the same technique, it's just two objects instead of an object and a grid line. So I was looking at things, and you can tell I didn't take the picture at exactly the same angle that I drew from, so there's some discrepancy, okay? But when I was looking, okay, where does the star fruit, where does this top of the star fruit intersect on that apple? And if I hold my pencil up here, I could say, okay, this intersects the apple halfway between the top and the bottom, or maybe 2/3 of the way, right? And then down here, this vertical line of the star fruit, which I can do hands on the clock to figure out what that angle is as it crosses the apple. Where does that cross? Well, that's about maybe 1/4 of the way, maybe 1/5 of the width of the apple, right? So being able to use the intersection points where the two objects overlap helps also with accuracy. And this one doesn't have like a piece of paper underneath to kind of separate it from the table at all, but if it did, right, you could use the paper in much the same way. You could use this line. This line intersects that apple where? You have a point here, you have a point here, you have hands on the clock to be able to assess and replicate that angle, right? You could even use negative space. So if this negative space here, right, can be measured and matched to the negative space you see up there, what do you see in these negative spaces down here that then we can also look at? Thinking about not just proportions, but now also values and color, we have what down here? We have shadows, okay? And because this is, you can tell, right, it's taken in a classroom setting where we have light sources all over the place, right? A classroom is supposed to have like really even lighting so that everybody can see, okay? For still life, which is what this is, that creates a lot of different shadows. Realistically speaking, you're getting one shadow from every light source, right? Now some are more obvious than others, and then some of them you really only see where maybe multiple shadows overlap. What do we notice? We can see a shadow here, we can see a shadow here, so there's two there. We can see a couple happening up here, although they're kind of blobbing together more. We see a little bit of one here, okay? But what do you notice between this shadow and this shadow up here? What are the main differences?
One's lighter, one's darker.
One's lighter and one's darker. So looking at how the shadows compare, just like we looked at how the proportions compare, that's important. What else do we notice about those shadows? How are they different?
There's a shadow of two fruits sitting on the left, and then on the right there's only one, so the edges look a little bit more even.
The edges are definitely different, right? The way the shadow goes from dark to light here is much more gradual. The way the shadow goes from dark to light here is a little bit more abrupt. It's not a hard line, but it's harder than the one over there. That's a really good observation because you can differentiate that in your drawing. That's going to help it look more realistic. We're still missing a really obvious one. What's different between this shadow in this shadow?
It's bigger.
Size is different.
It's lighter.
It is a little lighter. It has a color difference, right? So the shadow here is picking up color from what?
The green of the.
The green of the star fruit. And the shadow here is picking up color from what?
The green and the red.
Yeah, it's picking up some green here. More, if you look, and it might not be as obvious from where you're sitting, it's greener here and it's redder over here, right? So the shadow is going to pick up color from what's around it. That's why in photography, we get color casts, right? If you were to sit on like a field of grass, you would have green reflecting up into your face because light is coming down, bouncing off the green grass and bouncing back up into your face, right? That can be a good thing or it can be undesirable, right? But the point here is we need to be able to observe those things and notice those things so that we can make those subtle differences in our drawing because those are the kinds of details that are going to help it feel more realistic. Does that make sense? Okay. Now the shadows are going to kind of take on an entity just like the objects did. So shadows have proportions that we can compare and look at. Shadows also have value differences. You guys nailed that. They have lightness and darkness and they are different. You can't assume that all shadows are going to be the same, right? And you also picked up on the edges, the way it transitions from dark to light, right? So there's a shadow here, which is kind of the overlap between these two. There's a lighter one here with fadier edges. It's a very technical term, okay? And then right under the object is usually where you're going to see the sharpest shadow, right? Because it's blocking the most light because it's closest to the table. So we see a darker shadow here, and then we see, I obviously didn't finish that, we see a lighter shadow here, right? There's a gradient that goes from light to dark, okay? And then we also have the shadow between the two objects, so where that star fruit is blocking light from what's falling onto the apple, okay? So how do we actually color that so that it is realistic, okay? First of all, I did not use metallics, that makes sense because there's nothing that really calls for that, but I didn't use browns and I didn't use blacks or grays. How did I get my colors to look darker without using browns or blacks or grays?
Layering.
Layering, yep, and using the color wheel, okay? So there's 3 different things that you can encounter on your fruit that are going to need, there's more than 3, but we're going to focus on 3 on this slide, that need a particular technique, okay? We talked about highlights and shadows, right? There are, when you look at the fruit, right, the light is falling, in most cases from the top. That's usually where your highlights are going to be, and they might be one side or the other more so. And then as it gets towards the bottom, we work towards shadows. So here's the technique for that. If you have a, let's call it a red apple, right? Now even something like this, which has multiple colors in it, we would still say that most of this apple is red. We can think of this as a red apple, okay? So we start with a light layer of red, okay? And then as it gets towards the highlight areas of the apple, which is going to be probably more towards the top, but you'll observe and pay attention to where your highlights actually need to be, we are going to take a little journey around the color wheel towards yellow. So yellow is our highlight color, okay? So if we have a red apple, we're going around the color wheel towards yellow, what's the first color we're going to start blending in? Orange. Yep. And then after orange, as that highlight gets lighter, then we're going to blend in yellow. Make sense? Okay? Now, oppositely, in the shadow areas of that apple, we're going to start with our red, because that's the base color of the apple, right? And then we're going to work towards purple. So all shadows are going to work towards purple, all highlights are going to work towards yellow. Make sense? Okay? Now, a little trick, if purple doesn't make your shadow quite deep enough, we can go a little past purple and pull in some blue. Okay, a lot of artists do that. There tends to be blue in a lot of shadows because we just have a lot of blue in our surroundings, especially if we're outside. Why would there be blue in the shadows? Because of the sky, Absolutely. Okay, unless it's like, you know, a warmer, like sunsetty kind of color of the day. Okay, so does kind of journeying around the color wheel make sense for highlights and shadows? Okay, so if we had a green pear, we start with green. In the highlights, we move towards yellow. Okay, green is right next to yellow, so we got that. What do we do in the shadow areas?
Purple.
We move towards purple, but what's the first one that we're going to do?
Blue.
Blue, then purple. Make sense? Okay. In cases of shine, here is a very shiny example. Okay, shine, yellow is not going to do it. Yellow is going to do matte highlights, right? But shine needs to be what color?
What?
Needs to be white. Yep. Now you're going to experiment with your colored pencils in your sketchbook before you get to your finished drawing. Sometimes the white can actually color over other colors and it still looks white. Sometimes it doesn't, and it can't like stand up as white on its own. And sometimes you have to leave that part of the page white, or leave it uncolored so that you can color white just on the, you know, if you were using a colored paper. Does that make sense? Okay, so you'll experiment with that before you actually get to it. The other example of when you would use white would be if you have an object that is more pastel. So see the difference between these two in terms of color, right? And that's a big part of why we're doing this with fruit for your first mini still life drawing when you're replicating color, because fruit colors are more vivid. They're easier to replicate, right? But if you get something that's a little bit more pastel, you're going to have to blend in your yellow with your white as your base color. Is it flickering in here today?
Yeah.
Okay, does that make sense? So 2 cases where we use white, shine and pastel. Okay, everything else, highlights move towards yellow around the color wheel, and then shadows move towards purple. Now, you may have noticed in this example, the shadows are not only purple, but they're kind of grayish looking, right? How do we get our purple to look less purple and more grayish? First of all, what is that called when we make a color more grayish? Brownish. Guesses? What we're making is a neutral. We're neutralizing that color, right? You could call it muting that color. You could call it de-intensifying that color. What we're making the color is duller, right? Because in the shadow areas, there's less light, so you're not able to see as vividly. Does that make sense? So when we do that, instead of moving around the color wheel or moving towards white in cases of shine or pastel, we are moving across the color wheel. So by mixing in the complement or the opposite, we get those neutrals in the middle. And neutrals can lean more brown or more gray depending on how you mix them and in what proportions you use those colors. Okay, so if I have a red apple, okay, in my shadow areas, I'm going to work towards what color? I'm going to work towards what color?
Red.
Purple in the shadow areas, right? And then, if and when that looks too bright purple, then what am I going to add? I'm going to add yellow in there. Okay? And you kind of keep asking yourself, okay, this color looks too what? Let's say it looks too orange. What would we add to neutralize that orange? Blue, because it's the opposite. Does that make sense? Okay? So don't think of it like a recipe, right? We're not like looking for a specific shade of gray and we need like 3/4 of this color and 1/4 of this color. You're just going to start blending layers and then look for what does it look too much of, and then add that opposite. So it's like a series of adjustments, right? When you listen to a song on your earphones, you don't set a particular volume to a particular number that you know you're going to like. You listen to it first and you either go up or down, right? Same thing. Okay? Questions on neutrals? How else would you use a neutral, you might ask? Well, here's an example. Both of these apples are red, right? They're not the same red though, they don't look the same. So how would we differentiate? Manuel, you okay? Okay. This one's gonna be more kind of like straight out of the box red, right? This one, what are we gonna have to add to it? We're gonna have to add some purple, exactly. And if it looks too purple, then what?
Red.
Maybe more red, we could sandwich those layers.
Brown,
How do we make our brown?
yellow.
We add some yellow to the purple if it's too purple. Make sense? Okay, so that's why this looks so light yet. Remember I said it's only one class period worth of work, it's not done. As you progress through that drawing, your colors get richer and stronger and more solid looking. Okay, not flat looking, but just richer, right? But why are they so light right now?
Because they're not layered.
Well, there's not enough layers on them yet, is that what you mean? Yeah, exactly. So you want to add little bits of layering at a time so that you can control the color a little bit at a time, right? Even more so than with drawing pencils. You know how with drawing pencils, you get the graphite on there and eventually it gets like so shiny you just can't do anything else with it, it just kind of like, it maxes out, right? Colored pencils are wax-based, so once you get to a certain level of wax on the surface of the paper, it's just gonna kind of fill up the tooth of the paper and you're not able to take it any further. So if you build up these layers, light, 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 you can have more control to take that color more one way or more the other way and make those adjustments. And then when you get to the end, you have this nice buildup of rich layers and it's gonna look a lot more developed, a lot more vivid and strong. Does that make sense? Okay. Someone in the other class, which is a really good question, they said, what if you were to do a line like this, and the line has texture in the skin, right? Some of the oranges do too. It's called orange peel texture, right? What do you do in that case?
Add texture.
How do you add texture?
Like darker on some spots and lighter than others.
That you're doing it by way of adding values, and you're paying attention to the shine on the surface, right? So there's a big difference between something like this and something like this, right? The surface here is duller. We'll take it one step further. This one is really dull, okay? It's the transition between the shine, the highlights, and the shadows. On this one, they happen really gradually, right? On a really shiny fruit, like something like this, or something like this, right? The transition is very abrupt. They almost have like hard edges on those shapes of shine. Does that make sense? Okay. Think about when you watch the movie Shrek, you know, Princess Fiona, right? She has a green velvet dress. How do they make her dress look velvety? It's all in how they control the highlights and the shadows, right? Velvet would be different than something like satin. Satin is very, very high shine. That would have very abrupt, high contrast transitions between highlights and shadows. Velvet is kind of smoother transitions, more gradual. That's how they make those differences in the surface qualities. Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Questions on any of that? Okay, for today, you choose how you want to practice. You can choose to actually draw a fruit using proportion and color, okay? Or you can choose just to look at color today and do something more like this. I can post this video for you if you so choose, if that would be helpful. I did post some more citing information. This was another demo I did last year. We'll do another one of those later this week. This is what I'm talking about. I shaded basically one half of the color wheel, right? I started with yellow and I kind of worked my way around the color wheel, overlapping those colors, light layers of colors until I got to purple. You could do the same thing on the other side if you really felt compelled to do that. And then if you look at this edge, see how this edge is darker? I used what to make that edge darker? Not black, but
Brown.
Correct.
complementary colors. So it doesn't look like it, but it's purple here, and it's orange here, and it's green here, right? And it's yellow here. So mixing those complementary colors to get that rich, what's called a chromatic shadow instead of just using black, which flattens it out. And why don't we want to use black? Well, we're working really hard to make these fruit objects look dimensional, look 3D, look realistic, right? We don't see black in real life. We see that combination of colors. And black makes things look really flat. So why would we want to flatten things that we're working so hard to make look dimensional? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay? So you can do something like this today to practice your use of colors. You can do a single object like the lime that I showed you, okay? This one, I'll pull this up for you when we go through the rubric. This was a drawing that I myself created, which is a finished example of what yours is gonna look like. However, do not do yours on black paper, that's a terrible idea. But that's the, I showed you what the early layering looks like. This is what the finished layering looks like. Okay, questions?
Is that the only one of your projects we're gonna be able to see?
No, I'll show you the gumball machine if you want. But that one's paint, but it's the same concept. You wanna see the gumball machine?
Yeah.
So what painting is doing right now with their still life, they're doing the same thing but in paint. So see how these classes and these lessons build on each other?
Yeah.
So painting, still life. There you go.
Oh dang, okay.
Whoa,
Does that make sense?
that's cool.
Same exact concept, but in paint.
So
Okay, and if you really are that dedicated to watching me do this, I have a video of me doing this very painting.
ooh, I kinda like the tree. Do you have a picture of the tree one?
I do not. I only did the gumball machine.
You don't take pictures of your students' work?
I don't have a lot from that era, no.
Don't say
We
those
didn't have
students.
digital submission then like we do now,
Oh.
where I can just go in and have all of them in the critique document. We just actually put our work up on the board then. Different era.
So like,
Good
how do you
question.
like do the glass looking?
How do you do the glass?
that like-
That is exactly what we learned in painting this year. The short answer is you just paint what you see. So you have to kind of break it down, like what am I looking
Oh,
at?
so you don't really do
So
glass.
this
Okay, I see.
is the reflection of
Mhm.
the lamp that's up here, right? And when I'm looking through here, the transparency, I'm seeing the wall behind it, but it's a little bit lighter than the wall without
Oh,
the
I
glass.
see, okay.
So it's all comparisons, right? It's the exact same skills that you're doing now, just amped up a little bit. Same is true for reflective materials and reflective objects, things that are very shiny.
Oh, so you don't look at it as like glass, you look at it as like different shapes on the glass?
Yes, it's all just shapes of color and value. And then see how the background, it's purple out here because I was rushing. But see how the purple gets darker, but even if it's a little purple, it doesn't like strike you as bad, right? It still just livens it up and makes it look dimensional. Okay? Don't worry about this. This is beyond, okay? You guys are focusing on one object for right now. Moving forward, so you know what to expect. Wednesday, you have the ACT thing happening tomorrow, so I won't see you in normal class fashion. Wednesday, I'm gonna give you the pottery wheel demo. That is gonna take the whole time, but I need to give you that information so you know what to do. And then Thursday, I will do a fruit drawing demo so that you guys can see me walk through it. Now, full disclosure, is it the most interesting thing to watch in the world? No. Is it gonna feel like it's kind of long? Yeah. But I think it's important that you see how I work through it, right? That you can ask me questions and I can address them. And then Friday, you guys are on your own. We're gonna take over the light sources from where the painting students had their objects. We're gonna set up fruit. We're gonna put little colored paper underneath. So you can choose to work with a light source, okay? Like the pear, this has a light source on it as well. Or you can choose to just do it in room light, like the demo I showed you where you have like a bunch of shadows and the highlights and shadows are not as contrasty. Okay, that's a lot of information today. Questions? You feel okay? come either pick a fruit to practice with today, or if you just want to practice blending your colors, you can do that.
Can you post that color thing?
Post the color.
You like just showed it to us.
The slides?
No,
From today?
that like the strip of color.
Oh, yes, I will post that.